Now, what I want to do now is to talk a little bit about this idea of the rapture. You hear a lot about the rapture. What is the rapture? Why? I remember when I was a brand new Christian at Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, I went to the chapel store and I bought a couple of books. One was called The Tribulation in the Church, and the other one was called What the World is Coming to, both by Chuck Smith. Because I was young and impressionable, and I'm reading the back of the book, and it's like, can you imagine hailstones the size of an automobile mingled with blood being hurled at the earth? And I was like, oh, damn, like, this is nuts. This is like a Hollywood movie, right? And so I got sucked in, and I, very, very, very quickly became very familiar with this entire eschatological quagmire of a theology that evangelicalism offers. And I remember when I was eventually talked out of it after many years, ironically from a book intended to, it was a book by Arnold Fruchtenbaum called Israelology, the missing link in systematic theology or something like this, that a friend of mine from England gave me, to bolster and to solidify my dispensationalism. But ironically, it was this very book that sort of dispossessed me of this entire way of looking at things. I don't remember why I brought that up. But the rapture is something. First of all, what is the teaching of the rapture? The teaching of the rapture is this idea that at some point in the future, according to most evangelical pastors, it could happen any minute, but that's been the case my entire life. They've been saying this. God will snatch the believing Christians out of the world. Okay? God is going to remove in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, he's going to just rapture, he's going to snatch up the entire church. We're just going to disappear. And that's going to signal the once again, the ticking of God's prophetic time clock, which has 7 years left on its until it runs out. And I suppose, man, I told you this was a quagmire. It's like you need charts, graphs, and an easel just to explain it, which is itself makes it sort of sus, the fact that it's that hard to explain without like a whole bunch of math, But the idea is, and this flies in the face of the hermeneutical principle that I articulated last time about seeking to interpret unclear passages in light of clear ones. Remember that? It's just a basic principle that, when you're dealing with trying to deduce some sort of central message or unified message from varying genres of literature, prophetic, apocalyptic, prose, poetry, wisdom literature, well, you start with what's clear and you go from there. So you don't start with the most obscure, arcane, numerological texts, and then say that this is our starting point and we're going to launch off from here. No, you start with basic didactic teaching, that is intended to be understood like that kind of literature, didactic teaching that is meant to simply instruct. And then you can seek to see how all of the apocalyptic, poetic, metaphorical literature factors in. Right, but of course, evangelicalism, even though they would agree with that principle on paper, they don't do it. They violate that principle almost every time they step into the pulpit, because they begin with, in the case of the the millennial reign, which we'll look at eventually, they begin with Revelation 20, which is like, Revelation is notoriously complicated and convoluted and figurative, illustrative. It's the furthest thing from clear, right? But they start there with that. Same with this idea of Israel and the rapture, because as I want to show you, once the identity of Israel, as evangelicals understand it, namely that it refers to the nation state in the Middle East, once that is undermined, the whole house of cards falls apart. Everything falls apart once you've realized that you've gotten the identity of Israel wrong. The whole rest of the edifice just crumbles, right? So in the evangelical mindset, they go to Daniel 9, which if you read it, it's nuts. It's just like, what? It's this all this 77s are prophesied upon my people. And so there's the way that they understand that is that God promised that his dealings with his people Israel, so that's already mistaken. But God promised that his dealings with his people Israel will happen over the course of 70 7-year periods. 69 of them have elapsed, and it was when the Jews rejected Jesus, their Messiah, that God moved on to Plan B, right? So the prophetic time clock stopped after the 69th 7-year period, and they imagine that they can trace it from the decree of Artaxerxes for Nehemiah to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem up until the triumphal entry of Jesus, and that's somehow 173,880 days, which is the exact number, and it's one of those things where you do the math first, and then you just reverse engineer the history to make it fit. Anyway, so there is an extant 7-year period waiting, that 70th 7. According to evangelical eschatology, that is on hold while God is doing some other thing, right? So we're in this parenthetical moment where God is creating a church, right? So the plan A was for Israel to accept the Messiah. They rejected him, and so God just shifted gears into plan B, and then suddenly he's doing this church thing, which is like a ellipsis, a speed bump in God's plan. And that once he's done with the church, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, which they understand to mean once all the Gentiles who are going to be saved are saved, God will snatch the church out of the world, and there'll be another 7-year period of tribulation at the time of Jacob's trouble, which will, signal the end of God's prophetic dealings with Israel. And then, But as I've shown, when you understand Israel the way Paul did, when you understand Israel the way Jesus did, then that entire rationale falls apart. In other words, if Israel has always been, yes, under the old covenant, it was the nation of Israel, the physical descendants of Abraham, which is why Jesus concedes that you are the physical descendants of Abraham, which is why Paul calls them my kinsmen according to the flesh. But once you realize that was all, that entire arrangement from Adam, to the second Adam, and the whole schema was typological, seeking to illustrate a group of people from every kindred, tongue, tribe, and nation, right? Not just ethnic Jews. It's not about race, it's about grace, right? Once you realize that Israel has the heirs of God's saving promises have always been Jew or Gentile who believe in Christ, that those are the descent, those are the children of Abraham, right? Once you realize that the physical descendants of Abraham are nothing when it comes to God's promises, but it's those who have the faith of Abraham, whether they are Jew or Gentile, then all of a sudden, all these other machinations and complex, equations with 77s and all this stuff falls apart, right? When there is no distinction between Israel and the church when it comes to God's promises, because all that matters is not whether you're Jew or Gentile, but whether you believe in Jesus, whether you exercise the faith of Abraham, the father of faith. All of a sudden, you don't need 69 sevens where he's dealing with Israel, and then a pause, and then a church age where he's dealing with the church, and he doesn't overlap. These things don't overlap, and once the church is done, you take them out. Then you got 7 more years for Israel. You don't need any of that. The only reason you need any of that is because you've misunderstood who the heirs of God's promises are and built a whole theology and a whole entertainment industrial complex around it. It's very sensational, it's very sexy, I admit it, but it's also false and not biblical. So, when it comes to the rapture, the very rationale for the rapture is itself contingent upon a specific and incorrect understanding of who Israel is. Once you understand who Israel is, you don't need a rapture anymore. And as I'm going to show you in this talk, the proof texts for the rapture, and there's mainly just a couple of them, aren't talking about a rapture at all. It's not talking about what they call the rapture, okay? They have this preconceived and convoluted theological, biblical understanding of what the rapture is, and then they read that into 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. And so when they read those descriptions of that event, they're importing into it a whole host of assumptions, most of which are completely wrong.